The orphanage was quiet that night, save for the creaking of old floorboards as Sophia Miller paced back and forth in the small room she shared with 3 other girls. A faint moonlight spilled through the cracked window, highlighting her furrowed brows and the trembling hands she clenched into fists. Tonight, everything she knew was slipping through her fingers. "Sophia, are you coming?" a small voice asked. It was Claire, the youngest girl in the room, clutching a tattered teddy bear. Sophia forced a smile and nodded. "I'll be fine, Claire. Get some sleep," Sophia said softly, though her voice betrayed her fear. She brushed a stray tear from her cheek, unwilling to let the little girl see her crumble. Downstairs, in the orphanage's dimly lit office, her guardian, Mrs. Caldwell, was closing a deal. Sophia didn't need to hear the words to know her future was being sold. Mrs. Caldwell had summoned her earlier that evening, coldly informing her of the arrangement. A marriage, not for love, but for survival and money. Sophia could barely believe it. After years of scraping by, enduring hunger and hardship, she had dreamed of a way out. But not like this. Not into the hands of someone like Hunter Grayson, the infamous billionaire she'd only heard of in the news. Ruthless, calculating, cold. A man whose heart was rumored to be as impenetrable as the skyscrapers he owned. As she stood outside the office door, Sophia overheard snippets of the conversation. "She'll be well taken care of," Mrs. Caldwell assured. "I expect her to follow the rules," came a low, gravelly voice, Grayson's voice. Sophia's heart sank further. She felt like an item on a shelf, bartered away without her consent. But what choice did she have? The orphanage couldn't keep her much longer, and the world outside offered nothing but uncertainty. Maybe this cruel arrangement would at least provide stability. Maybe she could endure it. When the door opened, Hunter stood before her. His sharp suit and piercing blue eyes commanded attention, but there was no warmth in his gaze. He looked her over briefly, his expression unreadable. "This is her?" he asked, his tone clipped. Mrs. Caldwell nodded. "Sophia, this is Mr. Grayson. You'll leave with him tonight." Sophia's throat tightened. With no words to offer, she grabbed the single bag she'd hastily packed. Hunter gestured toward the limousine idling outside, its sleek black frame gleaming under the faint streetlights. As she stepped into the car, the weight of her situation settled fully onto her shoulders. Silent tears streamed down her face as the city blurred past the tinted windows. Her hands gripped the bag on her lap, knuckles white, as she thought of the life she was leaving behind and the unknown future ahead. The driver turned onto an empty stretch of road, and the silence inside the car became deafening. Sophia dared to glance at Hunter, who sat across from her. His eyes were fixed out the window, his posture rigid, his face void of any emotion. He seemed utterly detached, as if she were nothing more than another transaction. "Do you have any questions?" he asked finally, his voice startling her. Sophia hesitated. What do you expect from me?" Hunter turned to face her, his gaze cold and calculating. "Obedience, discretion, and no illusions. This isn't a fairy tale." Sophia swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. She looked back out the window, her reflection staring back at her like a stranger. The limousine pulled up to an iron gate that creaked open, revealing a sprawling estate. The mansion loomed ahead, its stone facade illuminated by harsh outdoor lights. It was breathtaking and intimidating, a symbol of wealth that only deepened Sophia's sense of isolation. As the car stopped, Hunter stepped out and extended a hand toward her. Sophia hesitated before taking it, her trembling fingers brushing his. "Welcome to your new life," he said, his voice devoid of warmth. Sophia's heart clenched. She wasn't sure if she'd just been saved or trapped. The Grayson mansion was as imposing inside as it was outside. Towering ceilings stretched above Sophia as she followed Hunter through the grand foyer. The marble floors gleamed, reflecting the cold, artificial light from crystal chandeliers. Everything about the space was breathtakingly luxurious, yet it felt lifeless, a hollow monument to wealth and power. Hunter didn't slow his pace, barely sparing her a glance as he strode ahead. His footsteps echoed sharply in the vast hall. Sophia hurried to keep up, clutching her bag tightly against her chest. The stillness of the house seemed to press down on her, making her small presence feel even smaller. "Tomorrow, we'll go over expectations," Hunter said abruptly, breaking the silence as they reached a set of double doors. "For now, you'll stay in the East Wing." Sophia nodded mutely, her throat too dry to manage a response. She couldn't shake the sense that she was being herded into a gilded cage, every step closer to a life that felt less like hers. Hunter pushed the doors open to reveal a large sitting room. Unlike the rest of the house, this space carried a hint of personality, though it was faint and distant, like a long-forgotten memory. A grand piano stood near the corner of the room, its sleek black surface gleaming under the dim lighting. It seemed oddly out of place amid the stark furniture and cold, neutral tones. Sophia's gaze lingered on the instrument, curiosity flickering through her unease. She had played the piano as a child, and something about this one called to her. Before she could think better of it, her fingers twitched with the urge to touch the keys. "Don't," Hunter said sharply, his tone cutting through the air like a blade. Sophia flinched, pulling her hand back instinctively. His expression remained cold, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of something she couldn't place. Pain? Anger? Both? "It's not a decoration," he added, his voice quieter but no less stern. "Leave it alone." Sophia swallowed hard and nodded. "I'm sorry," she murmured, unsure why the apology felt so heavy. Hunter's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment, he looked as though he wanted to say more. But instead, he straightened his posture and gestured toward the door on the far side of the room. "Your room is through there. You'll find everything you need." Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heel and left. The door clicked shut behind him, and the silence returned, oppressive and stifling. Sophia let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping as she allowed herself to feel the weight of the day. She stepped closer to the piano, drawn to it despite Hunter's warning. Her fingers hovered just above the keys, trembling with hesitation. The urge to play was overwhelming, but his words echoed in her mind, sharp and commanding. Instead, she backed away, sinking into one of the armchairs near the fireplace. Her eyes drifted around the room, taking in every detail. It was a beautiful space, yet devoid of warmth, much like the man who had brought her here. Sophia's thoughts swirled as exhaustion began to take hold. She was trapped in this strange, unfeeling place, with a man who seemed determined to keep her at arm's length. Yet something about him intrigued her, even if she didn't want to admit it. Beneath the icy exterior, there was something hidden, something she couldn't quite define. As she closed her eyes, one phrase lingered in her mind, spoken with finality in Hunter's cold voice. "This isn't a fairy tale." Sophia woke to the sound of distant footsteps echoing through the mansion. The room she had been assigned was large, far larger than she was accustomed to, with a bed so soft she'd barely moved during the night. Morning sunlight filtered through heavy drapes, casting long shadows on the ornate furniture. Despite the beauty of the space, it felt sterile, like a hotel room designed for show rather than comfort. She slipped out of bed and wrapped herself in the silk robe she had found hanging on the back of the door. Venturing into the hallway, Sophia felt the vast emptiness of the house more acutely. Every creak of the wooden floor beneath her feet echoed like a whisper in the silent corridors. The walls were lined with paintings, landscapes, and portraits that exuded wealth but lacked any personal connection. The mansion was enormous, every corner meticulously curated, but there was no sign of life in its grandeur. No photographs of family, no personal trinkets, nothing to suggest that anyone truly lived here. As she wandered, Sophia found herself drawn to a room at the end of a long corridor. The heavy door was slightly ajar, and inside was a study. Bookshelves stretched from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes. A massive desk sat in the center, its surface immaculate save for a few scattered papers. She stepped inside, her curiosity outweighing her hesitation. The room was different from the rest of the house. It felt used, lived in. A faint smell of coffee lingered in the air, and there was a warmth to the worn leather chair behind the desk. Her gaze fell on a silver frame sitting just off-center on one of the shelves. Sophia picked it up carefully, her heart skipping as she studied the photograph. It was a younger Hunter, his features softer and less guarded. His arm was draped protectively around a woman who looked to be in her 20s, with long, wavy hair and a warm, radiant smile. They seemed close, happy, even. The image was such a stark contrast to the cold, distant man she had met that it made her pause. "Put that down." The low, sharp voice startled her, and she nearly dropped the frame. Turning quickly, she found Hunter standing in the doorway, his expression hard and unreadable. His eyes flicked to the photograph in her hands, and something, pain, maybe, flickered across his face before disappearing. "I'm sorry," Sophia said quickly, setting the frame back in its place. "I didn't mean to pry." Hunter stepped into the room, his movements measured. He took the frame, studied it briefly, then placed it face down on the shelf. "Curiosity can be dangerous," he said, his voice clipped. "Especially here." Sophia bristled at the veiled warning, but chose to stay silent. She watched as Hunter turned and walked toward the desk, his posture rigid. His presence filled the room, making it feel smaller, more oppressive. "Why do you keep it?" she dared to ask, surprising even herself. Hunter's hand paused on the edge of the desk. For a moment, she thought he might answer, but when he finally spoke, his tone was colder than ever. "That's none of your concern." Sophia's chest tightened. She wanted to press further, to ask who the woman was and why the photo seemed to hold so much meaning, but she knew better. Instead, she nodded and backed toward the door. "Enjoy your exploration," Hunter said dryly as she left, his words tinged with something that almost sounded like mockery. As Sophia stepped back into the corridor, she exhaled shakily. The study and the photograph had raised more questions than answers, and she couldn't shake the feeling that whatever secrets this house held, they were tied to Hunter's tightly guarded past. She glanced back at the closed door behind her and whispered under her breath, "Who are you?" "Hunter Grayson." Sophia was halfway through an awkward breakfast in the dining room when a knock echoed from the doorway. She glanced up to see a man in his mid-30s, dressed sharply in a dark suit. His clean-shaven face carried a composed, professional expression, though his eyes hinted at weariness. "I'm Elijah Carter," he introduced himself, stepping into the room. "Hunter's attorney. I handle his personal and professional matters." He gave her a measured look, his tone polite but distant. Sophia set down her fork and stood, unsure whether to greet him with a handshake or simply nod. She opted for the latter. Elijah gestured for her to sit. "I came to check on you," he said, his voice softer now. "Adjusting to life here can be challenging." Sophia wasn't sure what to make of his choice of words. "It's different," she admitted cautiously. Elijah took a seat across from her, leaning forward slightly. "I've known Hunter for years," he said, choosing his words carefully. "He's not an easy man to understand, and he doesn't trust easily." Sophia frowned, unsure if that was a warning or an explanation. "He hasn't exactly been welcoming," she replied, her tone betraying her frustration. Elijah's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Pity, perhaps. Hunter's past shaped him into who he is. "You'll hear rumors, maybe even some truths, but you should tread carefully. There are things about this family that are best left alone." Sophia's heart sank. She had already sensed the weight of the secrets within the Grayson household, but Elijah's words only confirmed her suspicions. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice steady despite the unease curling in her chest. Elijah straightened. "Because you seem like someone who doesn't back down. That's not always a good thing in this house." He stood, adjusting his tie. "If you're smart, you'll focus on your role here and avoid getting entangled in anything else." Before Sophia could respond, he turned to leave. "Good luck, Sophia," he said over his shoulder, his words heavy with implication. As Elijah disappeared down the hall, Sophia sat back in her chair, her appetite forgotten. What was he trying to protect her from? And why did he seem so resigned, as if he'd already seen others fail to heed his warning? Later that afternoon, while wandering through the mansion, Sophia stumbled upon Mrs. Reynolds, the elderly housekeeper who had been kind enough to show her around the previous day. The woman was dusting the edges of a large mirror in one of the sitting rooms, her movements slow but precise. "Mrs. Reynolds?" Sophia ventured, her voice tentative. The housekeeper turned, her weathered face breaking into a kind smile. "Ah, Miss Sophia. Settling in, are we?" Sophia hesitated before responding. "I suppose. It's hard to feel at home here." Mrs. Reynolds nodded knowingly. "This house can do that. It's too big, too quiet. But it's not just the size, is it?" Sophia bit her lip, debating whether to share her unease. "It feels heavy, like there's something more to it." The housekeeper's smile faded, and her gaze turned distant. "This house has seen too much grief to ever feel alive again," she said softly, her tone filled with sadness. "What kind of grief?" Sophia pressed, stepping closer. Mrs. Reynolds hesitated, then shook her head. "That's not my place to say, dear. But take care. Curiosity has cost people dearly in this house." Sophia's chest tightened. First Elijah, now Mrs. Reynolds. They both seemed to carry the weight of unspoken truths. As the housekeeper returned to her work, Sophia found herself standing alone in the vast room, her reflection staring back at her from the polished mirror. The longer she looked, the more she felt like the house was watching her back, waiting for her to uncover whatever secrets it was hiding. The evening air hung heavy in the mansion, the stillness amplifying every creak and distant echo. The wedding ceremony earlier had been quick and perfunctory, devoid of emotion, much like the man Sophia had married. Now, alone in the dimly lit sitting room, she felt the weight of her new reality pressing down on her. Sophia's gaze fell once again on the grand piano in the corner. Earlier, Hunter's sharp tone had warned her away from it, but now curiosity gnawed at her. The polished surface reflected the warm glow of the chandelier, beckoning her closer. She hesitated for a moment, then moved toward it, her bare feet silent on the marble floor. Sitting on the bench, she ran her fingers lightly across the keys. The cool ivory sent a shiver through her, and an unexpected sense of familiarity washed over her, as though the instrument held a story waiting to be told. Tentatively, she pressed a single note, its sound ringing out clear and pure. Before she realized it, her hands began to move, fingers finding a melody that seemed to pour from her without thought or effort. The haunting tune filled the room, soft yet resonant, each note carrying a melancholic weight that tugged at her chest. She didn't know where the music came from, only that it felt both deeply personal and utterly foreign. The sound of footsteps snapped her from her reverie. Hunter stood in the doorway, his figure silhouetted against the light from the hall. His face was rigid, his eyes locked on her hands as they hovered over the keys. "Where did you learn that?" he demanded, his voice low but laced with an intensity that made Sophia freeze. She blinked, confused by the sudden shift in his demeanor. I don't know," she stammered. "I just played." Hunter stepped closer, his gaze darkening. "Don't lie to me," he said, his tone sharper now. "That song. It's impossible for you to know it." Sophia frowned, withdrawing her hands from the piano. "I'm not lying," she said firmly, though her voice wavered. "I don't even know what it is. It just came to me." Hunter's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he seemed lost in thought. His usually guarded expression cracked, revealing something raw beneath the surface. "That song died with Elise," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. Sophia's breath caught. She had heard the name before, in whispers, in half-answers from the house staff. But this was the first time Hunter had spoken it aloud, and the weight of it was palpable. Whoever Elise was, she had meant something to him, something irreplaceable. "I don't understand," Sophia said, her voice soft. "Who was Elise?" Hunter's gaze snapped back to her, the vulnerability in his eyes vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. "Stay away from this piano," he said coldly, "and stay out of things you don't understand." Before she could respond, he turned and walked away, his footsteps fading into the distance. Sophia sat there for a moment, staring at the piano, her fingers still tingling from the melody they had played. Who was Elise? And why did this song matter so much? The questions churned in her mind as she left the room, feeling the mansion's silence closing in around her like a shroud. The atmosphere between Sophia and Hunter remained tense following the incident at the piano. Though Hunter had returned to his usual cold, detached demeanor, Sophia couldn't shake the momentary crack she had seen in his armor. It wasn't just anger, it was pain, and whatever had caused it was tied to Elise. Sophia moved cautiously around the mansion, unsure how to navigate her new existence. Hunter's icy presence was a constant reminder of the boundaries she wasn't supposed to cross, but curiosity gnawed at her. The questions surrounding Elise refused to leave her mind. Who was she? Why did the mention of her name leave such a visible mark on Hunter? One afternoon, as Sophia wandered through the East Wing, she noticed Hunter lingering in the library. He was seated by the large bay window, staring out at the sprawling gardens with an expression she couldn't read. For the first time, he didn't seem to notice her presence. His gaze was distant, his shoulders unusually slouched. She paused, debating whether to say something, but decided against it. Instead, she turned quietly and continued exploring the house. Her steps led her to a corridor she hadn't seen before, the air growing cooler as she ventured further. It was dimly lit, the windows covered by heavy curtains that blocked the sunlight. A series of doors lined the hallway, but one in particular caught her attention. The door was unremarkable at first glance, but the small plaque above it stopped her in her tracks. Elise was carved into the wood, the letters elegant yet faded with time. Sophia's breath hitched. This wasn't just a room, this was her room. She approached cautiously, her hand trembling as she reached for the doorknob. It didn't budge. Locked. Of course, she thought, biting her lip in frustration. But the existence of the room alone was a revelation. It was proof that Elise had once been a significant part of this house, of Hunter's life. The faint sound of footsteps approaching snapped Sophia out of her thoughts. She stepped back from the door, her heart pounding as she turned to see Hunter standing at the end of the hallway. His eyes immediately locked onto the door she had been investigating. "What are you doing here?" he asked, his voice low and sharp. "I was just exploring," Sophia replied, trying to keep her tone even. She gestured vaguely to the corridor. "I didn't know this part of the house was off-limits." Hunter's jaw tightened, and he closed the distance between them in a few measured strides. "This room is none of your concern," he said firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Stay out of it." Sophia held his gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Who was she, Hunter? Why can't I know about her?" His expression darkened, but instead of lashing out, he simply turned away. "You don't want to understand," he said, his voice softer now, almost a whisper. "Some things are better left buried." Without another word, he walked past her, leaving her alone in the shadowy corridor. As his footsteps faded, Sophia turned back to the door labeled Elise. Whatever secrets this house held, she was determined to uncover them, no matter what it took. Sophia sat across from Elijah in the small sitting room she had begun to claim as her own refuge in the mansion. The sunlight streamed through the windows, its warmth contrasting with the tension that filled the space. Elijah had agreed to meet her after some persistence, though his guarded expression made it clear he wasn't entirely comfortable. "Why do you want to know about Elise?" Elijah asked, his tone carefully neutral as he rested his clasped hands on the table between them. Sophia hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "Because her name lingers in every corner of this house. I don't know who she was, but I can feel the weight of her absence. And I think understanding her might help me understand Hunter." Elijah studied her, his dark eyes narrowing slightly as though weighing whether she deserved the truth. After a long pause, he leaned back in his chair and exhaled deeply. "Elise Grayson was the opposite of her brother," he began, his voice tinged with a rare softness. "She was kind, compassionate, a dreamer in a family that valued power above all else. She was the light in this house, and everyone who knew her adored her." Sophia leaned forward, captivated by his words. "What happened to her?" Elijah's expression darkened. "She disappeared 10 years ago. Officially, it's listed as a tragic accident. But those of us close to the family know it was far more complicated than that." Sophia frowned. "What do you mean?" Elijah glanced toward the door, as though ensuring they were truly alone. "Elise was determined to expose a corrupt adoption ring that was tied to some very powerful people. She found out that children were being sold, trafficked under the guise of legitimate adoptions. She gathered evidence and was close to blowing the whole operation wide open. Sophia's chest tightened as she listened. And then she vanished, Elijah said grimly. No one knows for sure what happened. Hunter. He took it harder than anyone. He blames himself for not protecting her, for not being there when it mattered most. Sophia processed the information, her mind racing. Elisa's story added another layer to the enigma of the Grayson family and to Hunter himself. Why would Hunter blame himself? She asked gently. Elijah hesitated, then leaned forward, his voice low. Because he thought he could shield her from the world's cruelty by being the shield himself. But Elise was relentless. She believed in doing the right thing, no matter the cost. The weight of Elijah's words settled over Sophia, leaving her with more questions than answers. Before she could probe further, Elijah rose to his feet. Be careful, Sophia. Curiosity can be dangerous, especially when it comes to Elise. After Elijah left, Sophia returned to the sitting room where the piano stood. She couldn't stop thinking about Elise, her bravery, her compassion, and the tragic end to her story. Almost instinctively, Sophia sat at the piano and traced her fingers along its keys, wondering if it held any more secrets. Her fingers brushed the edge of the bench, and something shifted beneath her touch. Startled, she lifted the seat and found a small, leather-bound journal tucked inside. The initials E.G. were engraved on the cover in delicate script. Sophia's hands trembled as she opened the journal. The pages were filled with elegant handwriting, notes about the adoption ring, names, dates, and personal reflections. One entry stood out, written just days before Elisa's disappearance. If anything happens to me, I hope this reaches someone who will finish what I started. The truth deserves to be known, no matter the cost. Sophia's breath hitched. This wasn't just a journal. It was Elisa's voice, her mission, her legacy. Holding the journal close, Sophia felt a surge of determination. She didn't know how, but she would uncover the truth Elise had tried so hard to reveal. And for the first time since arriving at the mansion, she felt a flicker of purpose. Sophia hesitated outside the library door, clutching Elisa's journal to her chest. Confronting Hunter wasn't something she relished, but the weight of the words she'd read made it impossible to stay silent. Elisa's story wasn't just a memory. It was unfinished, and Sophia felt compelled to know more. Taking a steadying breath, she knocked softly and pushed the door open. Hunter sat by the window, his usual cold mask firmly in place as he leafed through a thick folder of documents. He looked up, his piercing eyes narrowing at her intrusion. "What do you want?" he asked, his tone clipped but not entirely dismissive. Sophia stepped into the room, her hands tightening around the journal. "I found this," she said quietly, holding it out for him to see. Hunter's gaze shifted to the journal, and for a moment, his stoic demeanor cracked. He froze, his eyes lingering on the initials engraved on the cover. Slowly, he stood and took it from her, his fingers brushing against hers as he did. His hand trembled slightly. "Where did you find this?" he demanded, his voice low but taut with emotion. "In the piano bench," Sophia admitted. "I didn't mean to pry, but I think she wanted someone to find it." Hunter sank into the armchair, staring at the journal as though it might burn him. "This belonged to Elise," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. His usual sharpness was replaced with something softer, almost fragile. Sophia sat across from him, the distance between them filled with unspoken tension. "Hunter," she began cautiously. Elise was trying to expose something terrible. She knew the risks, but she still chose to fight for what she believed in. Why didn't anyone help her? Hunter's jaw clenched, and he turned his gaze to the window. "Do you think I didn't try?" he said bitterly. "She wouldn't listen. She thought she could handle it on her own, and I let her believe that because I was too arrogant to think anyone could touch her." Sophia felt a pang of sympathy. This wasn't the detached, emotionless man she had come to expect. This was someone burdened by guilt, someone who had lost more than he knew how to bear. "She was brave," Sophia said softly, "but she didn't deserve to face it alone." Hunter closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. For a moment, the room was silent, the weight of the conversation pressing down on both of them. When he opened his eyes again, There was a glimmer of vulnerability in his expression. She was the only person who ever believed I could be more than what this family expected, he said. When she was gone, I became everything she hated. Sophia leaned forward, her voice steady. You're not beyond redemption, Hunter. She wouldn't have wanted you to carry this guilt forever. Hunter's gaze met hers, and for a brief moment, the walls he had so carefully built around himself seemed to waver. You talk like you knew her, he said, a faint trace of something softer in his tone. Sophia shook her head. I didn't, but I feel like I do, through her journal. She wanted to make the world better, and she believed in you. That hasn't changed. Before Hunter could respond, the sound of heels clicking against the marble floor echoed through the hallway. Margaret Donovan, a tall, elegant woman with an air of calculated poise, appeared in the doorway. Her sharp green eyes swept over the room, lingering on Sophia. Interrupting something? Margaret asked, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. Hunter straightened, his mask slipping back into place. What do you want, Margaret? Margaret ignored him, her attention fixed on Sophia. We haven't had the chance to get acquainted, she said smoothly. I'm an old family friend. Sophia stood, uneasy under Margaret's scrutinizing gaze. Sophia Miller, she said, extending a hand. Margaret shook it lightly, her grip firm despite the perfunctory gesture. Well, Sophia, I hope you're finding your stay enlightening, but take care. Curiosity can be dangerous. Her words were polite, but the undercurrent of warning was unmistakable. Sophia held her ground, her pulse quickening. Sometimes, curiosity is necessary to find the truth. Margaret's smile widened, but her eyes remained cold. Truth has a way of getting people into trouble, she said, turning to leave. Be careful where you dig. As Margaret's footsteps faded, Sophia glanced back at Hunter. His expression was unreadable again, but his hands were still gripping Elise's journal tightly. I don't trust her, Sophia said quietly. You shouldn't, Hunter replied. For the first time, there was no edge to his voice, just quiet agreement. The storm rolled in suddenly, dark clouds blanketing the sky and sending rain lashing against the windows of the Grayson mansion. Thunder growled in the distance, growing louder with every passing minute. Sophia sat in the sitting room, reading one of the books she'd taken from the library when the lights flickered once, then went out entirely. The silence that followed was unnerving. Great, she muttered, setting the book down and standing. She fumbled her way to the door, the faint light of the storm outside her only guide. The mansion felt even more cavernous in the dark, every creak of the old structure amplified by the howling wind. Sophia? Hunter's voice called from down the hall. His tone was sharper than usual, carrying an urgency she hadn't heard before. Here, she called back, stepping into the corridor. His silhouette emerged from the shadows moments later, his expression strained. Stay where I can see you, he instructed. This place isn't exactly safe to navigate in the dark. Sophia raised an eyebrow. What, afraid I'll trip on a priceless antique? She quipped, attempting to lighten the mood. Hunter didn't smile, but his features softened just slightly. Something like that, he muttered, gesturing for her to follow. They made their way to the sitting room, where Hunter lit a few candles from a drawer. The warm glow cast flickering shadows on the walls, and for the first time, the space felt less imposing. You'd think a house like this would have a backup generator, Sophia remarked, taking a seat in one of the armchairs. Hunter sat across from her, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. It does. Margaret's supposed to oversee maintenance. Clearly, she hasn't been doing her job. Sophia noted the slight jab at Margaret, but chose not to comment. Instead, she leaned back, letting the storm's symphony fill the silence between them. What was your childhood like? She asked suddenly, her curiosity overcoming her usual caution. Hunter looked at her, his expression guarded. Why do you want to know? Because, Sophia said simply, I think the more I understand about you, the less intimidating this place might feel. For a long moment, Hunter said nothing. Then he leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. It wasn't a childhood, he said finally. Not really. Elise was the only bright spot. Everything else was expectations, rules, and reminders of how little I measured up to the Grayson name. Sophia frowned. That sounds lonely. Hunter's gaze met hers, and there was a vulnerability there that surprised her. It was. Elise was the only one who believed I could be something more than what our family wanted. She must have been incredible, Sophia said softly. She was, Hunter replied, his voice distant. And when she was gone, it felt like everything good went with her. The storm rumbled outside, and for a moment, the only sound was the rain hammering against the windows. Sophia hesitated, then decided to take a chance. You're not as far gone as you think, Hunter. He raised an eyebrow, a hint of a wry smile appearing. Is that so? Sophia nodded. I think you've just spent so long trying to be what you think everyone expects that you've forgotten who you really are. Hunter's smile faded, replaced by a contemplative look. You remind me of her, he said quietly. Sophia blinked. Elise? He shook his head. No, you remind me of the person I wanted to be. Before everything went wrong. The words hung in the air, their weight settling between them. Sophia's breath caught, her chest tightening at the raw honesty in his voice. Before she could respond, a loud crack of thunder shook the house, startling them both. Hunter stood abruptly, clearing his throat. We should check the windows upstairs, he said, his tone back to its usual formality. Sophia nodded, though her thoughts were still spinning from his admission. As they climbed the stairs together, the candlelight flickering between them, she couldn't help but feel that the storm wasn't just outside. It was inside this house, inside them both, shifting something unspoken into motion. The morning after the storm, Sophia found herself in the library once more, determined to make sense of the fragments of truth she had uncovered. The house felt quieter than usual, its vast halls carrying a sense of anticipation. She sifted through the papers she had gathered, her hands trembling slightly as she pieced together connections she hadn't noticed before. Among the documents left unattended in the study were estate records, financial statements, and a ledger that seemed out of place. The more she read, the clearer it became. Margaret Donovan had ties to the orphanage where Sophia had spent her childhood. Payments had been made under her name, marked as donations, but the amounts were staggering, far beyond what a simple act of charity would suggest. Sophia's heart raced as the implications settled in. Margaret's involvement with the orphanage wasn't benevolent. It was calculated. These payments could explain the strange disappearances and unsettling rumors that had haunted her early years. Gripping the papers tightly, Sophia marched toward Hunter's office, her resolve outweighing her trepidation. She found him seated at his desk, reviewing files with his usual air of authority. When she entered, he looked up, his expression unreadable. "What is it?" he asked, his tone neither welcoming nor dismissive. Sophia closed the door behind her and placed the documents on his desk. "I found this in the library," she said, her voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through her. "It links Margaret to the orphanage where I grew up. I think she was involved in something illegal." Hunter's eyes flicked to the papers, his expression darkening as he skimmed them. "Where did you find these?" "In your study," she admitted. "I wasn't snooping, I swear. But this isn't a coincidence, Hunter. Margaret's tied to my past, and I think Elise knew something about it." Hunter sat back, his gaze fixed on the papers as his fingers tapped rhythmically on the desk. "These payments, they're too large to be legitimate," he said after a moment. "If what you're saying is true, Margaret may have had a hand in more than just shady deals." Sophia stepped closer, her voice trembling. This might be why Elise was investigating the adoption ring. And if Margaret was involved, then... Hunter looked up, his eyes meeting hers with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Then she's more dangerous than I thought," he finished. Sophia nodded, her hands balling into fists at her sides. "We have to do something. If Margaret was part of the adoption ring, then she's responsible for what happened to Elise. And to all those children." Hunter's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing as a flicker of anger passed over his face. "If she's hurt you, she'll pay," he said firmly, his voice laced with quiet fury. "But we need more proof before we can act." The conviction in his words surprised her. For the first time, she saw Hunter not as the cold, distant man she had married, but as someone willing to fight for justice, not just for Elise, but for her as well. Sophia sat across from him, her determination matching his. "How do we find that proof?" she asked. Hunter leaned forward, his fingers steepled under his chin as he considered their next move. "Margaret has kept herself insulated, but there are cracks in every facade. We'll start by tracing these payments and finding anyone who worked at the orphanage during that time. If we dig deep enough, we'll find what she's hiding." Sophia nodded, feeling a flicker of hope for the first time since uncovering the journal. "I'll help however I can." Hunter's gaze softened, and for a moment, the distance between them seemed to vanish. "You've already done more than enough," he said quietly. "Elise would have admired your courage." The mention of Elise sent a pang through her chest, but it also strengthened her resolve. As Hunter returned his focus to the documents, Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that they were finally moving toward uncovering the truth. And for the first time, she felt that she wasn't facing this fight alone. The mansion was quiet that evening, a heavy stillness settling over its grand halls. Sophia sat in her room, the faint hum of the storm lingering in her ears as she pored over Elise's journal once more. Each entry revealed a glimpse of a courageous woman who had fought tirelessly to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. But one particular page caught her eye, its edges creased as though it had been handled more than the others. "I met a girl today. She reminded me of why I started this fight in the first place." Her eyes were filled with fear, but she didn't cry. Not even once. "If I can do one thing right in this life, it will be ensuring she finds safety. I won't let them take her future like they've taken so many others." Sophia's breath hitched as she read the words. The girl Elise described, it couldn't be. She flipped through the journal, her fingers trembling as she searched for more clues. Another entry stopped her heart. "The orphanage is part of their operation. I saw the ledgers myself. Names turned into numbers, numbers into money. It's monstrous. But I managed to get her out before they could sell her. She's with Mrs. Caldwell now, safe for the moment. I only hope she stays that way until I can put an end to this." Sophia's chest tightened as realization washed over her. The entries weren't just about someone else, they were about her. Elise had saved her from the adoption ring, risking everything to pull her from the clutches of Margaret and her associates. The room blurred as tears filled Sophia's eyes. Memories she had buried long ago resurfaced in flashes. The cold, unfamiliar faces at the orphanage, the hushed conversations between adults, the feeling of being shuffled from one place to another without understanding why. And now, the truth. She had been part of something much darker, a pawn in a game she didn't even know she was playing. "Elise saved me," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I owe her everything." She clutched the journal to her chest, the weight of Elise's sacrifice pressing down on her. But with that weight came a fierce determination. Elise had fought for her life, for her future. She wouldn't let that sacrifice be in vain. Sophia hurried to find Hunter. She found him in the library, his attention fixed on a map spread across the desk. He glanced up as she entered, his brow furrowing at the sight of her tear-streaked face. "What happened?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. Sophia held up the journal. "I need you to read this," she said, placing it in front of him. Hunter hesitated, then opened the journal, his eyes scanning the pages as Sophia paced the room. Minutes passed in silence, each one stretching painfully. Finally, he closed the journal, his expression unreadable. "She saved you," he said quietly, the words more statement than question. Sophia nodded. "She didn't just save me. She left clues, Hunter. She was trying to expose Margaret, to take her down before she could hurt anyone else. And now we have to finish what Elise started." Hunter stood, his gaze piercing. "This changes everything," he said. "If Margaret was involved in the adoption ring, and Elise found proof of it, then we can use this. We can make her pay." Sophia stepped closer, her voice steady despite the storm of emotions raging inside her. "We'll need more than just the journal. If we're going to take Margaret down, we need undeniable evidence." Elise mentioned ledgers. "Do you think they still exist?" Hunter considered her words, his jaw tightening as he weighed their options. "If they do, Margaret would have hidden them somewhere secure. But we have leverage now, something she doesn't know we have." Sophia nodded, her resolve hardening. Elise risked her life for this. I'm not going to let her efforts go to waste. For the first time since their strange partnership began, Hunter reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. The gesture was brief, but filled with meaning. Neither will I, he said firmly. The two shared a moment of quiet understanding before Hunter stepped back, his sharp, calculating demeanor returning. We'll start by looking into Margaret's financial records. If those ledgers still exist, they'll lead us to them. And if she tries to stop us, she won't, Sophia said, her voice unwavering. Not this time. The storm outside seemed to mirror the storm within them, unrelenting and powerful. Sophia knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope. Elise's legacy wasn't just a tragedy. It was a call to action. And together, she and Hunter would see it through. The plan was straightforward in theory, but fraught with risk in execution. Hunter and Sophia had uncovered a lead suggesting that Margaret's involvement in the adoption ring was deeper than they had imagined. A set of hidden documents, kept in a safe at Margaret's secondary estate, could hold the key to exposing her crimes. The night was dark and silent as Hunter parked the car a safe distance from Margaret's property. The estate loomed ahead, its sprawling grounds dotted with security cameras and patrolling guards. Sophia clutched the bag of tools Hunter had given her, her heart racing as the weight of what they were about to do settled over her. This isn't your fight, Hunter said quietly, glancing at her. You don't have to come with me. Sophia met his gaze, her determination unwavering. It is my fight, she said firmly. Elise fought for me, and I won't back down now. Hunter nodded, a flicker of admiration passing through his eyes. Stay close, and if anything happens, get out. No hesitation. They crept onto the property, moving through the shadows with practiced precision. Hunter had mapped out the security patterns, and they timed their movements to avoid detection. Adrenaline surged through Sophia as they approached the house, each step bringing them closer to their goal. Inside, the air was heavy with the scent of polished wood and aged leather. The safe was in Margaret's private office, a room lined with bookshelves and expensive artwork. Hunter knelt by the safe, his fingers working deftly with the tools. Sophia stood by the door, her ears straining for any sound of movement. Almost there, Hunter murmured, his voice calm despite the tension in the air. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hall. Sophia's breath caught, her grip tightening on the doorframe. She turned to warn Hunter, but he was already standing, his body tense. Hide, he whispered, shoving the bag of tools into his jacket. Sophia ducked behind the desk just as the door creaked open. A guard stepped inside, his flashlight sweeping across the room. Sophia held her breath, her heart pounding in her ears. The beam of light passed inches from her hiding spot, and she clenched her fists to keep from shaking. Hunter stepped forward, his expression calm and unyielding. You're not supposed to be here, the guard said, his hand moving toward the radio on his belt. Neither are you, Hunter replied, his voice icy. Before the guard could react, Hunter lunged, disarming him with a swift, calculated move. The guard hit the ground with a muffled groan, unconscious. Sophia emerged from her hiding spot, her legs trembling. That was close, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Hunter nodded, his gaze sharp. We don't have much time. Let's go. They retrieved the documents from the safe and slipped out of the house just as the guards began to stir. The escape was a blur of motion and urgency, the weight of their discovery driving them forward. Once they were back in the car, the tension finally broke. Sophia exhaled shakily, her hands trembling as she clutched the folder of documents. We did it, she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. Hunter turned to her, his eyes scanning her face. Are you hurt? He asked, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. Sophia shook her head. No, I'm fine. You? I'm fine, he said, but his gaze lingered, his expression uncharacteristically open. You didn't have to come. You put yourself in danger for this. For you, Sophia corrected, her voice trembling slightly. For Elise. For everyone she wanted to protect. Hunter reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. You're braver than anyone I've ever known, he said quietly. And I don't deserve your trust. Sophia looked at him, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. You're not the man you think you are, Hunter. You're better than that. The words hung between them, heavy with unspoken emotions. Before either of them could think better of it, Hunter leaned closer, his hand cupping her cheek as his lips met hers. The kiss was a blend of passion and desperation, a release of all the tension and fear that had built between them. Sophia's hands found their way to his shoulders, gripping him as though he might vanish if she let go. When they finally broke apart, their foreheads rested against each other, their breaths mingling in the quiet of the car. Hunter's voice was a whisper, barely audible. You've changed everything, Sophia. Sophia smiled faintly, her heart full despite the storm they were about to face. And you've shown me that I'm stronger than I ever thought I could be. The car's engine roared to life, breaking the moment. As they drove away from Margaret's estate, the stolen documents safely tucked in the back seat, Sophia knew their fight was far from over. But for the first time, she felt truly ready to face whatever came next, with Hunter by her side. The following morning, tension rippled through the Grayson mansion. Hunter and Sophia pored over the documents retrieved from Margaret's estate, the weight of their implications sinking in with every page. Names, dates, and financial records, each one a thread in a web of corruption tied to the adoption ring Elise had fought to expose. This is enough to bring her down, Sophia said, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions surging within her. Hunter, seated beside her, frowned. It's enough to start unraveling her operation, but Margaret won't go down without a fight. She's too connected, too insulated. A knock on the door interrupted their discussion. Elijah entered, his expression uncharacteristically grim. He carried a folder in his hand, its contents hidden beneath his tightly gripped fingers. We have a problem, Elijah said without preamble. Margaret knows. Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. Knows what? Everything, Elijah replied. His tone clipped. She's already started moving assets and silencing anyone who might speak against her. You've rattled the cage, and now she's fighting back. Hunter leaned forward, his jaw tightening. How? Elijah placed the folder on the desk, opening it to reveal a series of surveillance photos. Sophia's heart sank as she recognized herself and Hunter, captured near Margaret's estate the previous night. She's had you followed for weeks, Elijah continued. She knew you'd eventually dig too deep. Last night was the final straw. Sophia's breath caught. So, what now? Does she know we have the documents? Elijah nodded grimly. She does, and she's already setting a trap to discredit you both. But that's not all. This, he gestured to the folder, is just the surface. You don't know how deep this goes. Hunter's eyes narrowed. Then tell us. Elijah hesitated, his hand lingering on the edge of the desk. If I tell you, I'm putting myself in Margaret's crosshairs. This isn't just about money or power. She's part of something far bigger than you realize. Sophia stepped forward, her voice firm. You've helped her for years, Elijah. If you're here now, it's because you've already chosen a side. Whatever you're risking, it's nothing compared to the lives she's destroyed. Elijah's gaze shifted to her, a flicker of something unreadable passing over his face. After a long pause, he nodded. Margaret used the adoption ring to build alliances with powerful people, politicians, business leaders, even law enforcement. It was never just about the money. It was about control. Taking her down means exposing all of them. Hunter's expression darkened, his fists clenching on the desk. Then we expose them. Elijah's lips pressed into a thin line. It's not that simple. These people will do whatever it takes to protect themselves. And if you're not careful, you'll be next on their list. Sophia exchanged a glance with Hunter, her resolve hardening. We've come too far to stop now, she said. Elise fought for this. She died for this. We can't let her work be for nothing. Hunter nodded, his eyes never leaving Elijah's. What's your plan? Elijah exhaled, his shoulders sagging slightly. I've already started pulling files from Margaret's accounts, transactions, communications, everything I can find. But it's dangerous. If she realizes what I'm doing, it won't end well for me. Sophia stepped closer, her voice softening. Why are you doing this, Elijah? Why now? For the first time, Elijah's composure cracked. Because I owed Elise, he said quietly. She tried to save me, too. I didn't listen then, and it cost her everything. This is my chance to make it right. The room fell silent, the weight of his words hanging heavy in the air. Finally, Hunter spoke. If Margaret's setting a trap, we'll spring it on our terms. But we need to move fast. Elijah nodded, his professional demeanor returning. I'll get you what you need, but you'll have to be ready to act as soon as I do. As Elijah turned to leave, Sophia's voice stopped him. Elijah, she said, her tone firm but grateful. Thank you. He hesitated in the doorway, his gaze meeting hers. Don't thank me yet, he said, his voice low. This fight is far from over. When the door clicked shut behind him, Hunter turned to Sophia. We're running out of time. Sophia nodded, her mind racing with possibilities. Then we'd better make every second count. As they returned to the documents, the storm outside the mansion mirrored the one brewing within. They knew the risks, the dangers that lay ahead. But for Elise, for the countless lives Margaret had destroyed, they would see it through to the end. The grand ballroom glittered with opulence, the chandeliers casting warm light over the sea of wealthy guests. The air buzzed with laughter and polite conversation, a carefully orchestrated symphony of wealth and power. Margaret Donovan stood at the center of it all, her presence commanding as she greeted her guests with a practiced smile. Sophia adjusted the hem of her gown, her fingers trembling slightly as she exchanged a glance with Hunter. His jaw was set, his expression unreadable beneath the sharp lines of his tuxedo. Together, they stepped into the lion's den, their mission clear. Expose Margaret and bring her empire crashing down. Are you ready? Hunter murmured, his voice low enough for only Sophia to hear. She nodded, her resolve steady despite the storm of nerves in her chest. Let's finish this. They moved through the crowd, mingling briefly before making their way to the stage at the front of the room. Elijah's warnings echoed in Sophia's mind. Margaret wouldn't go down without a fight, but they had no choice. Too many lives depended on this moment. Hunter took the microphone, his deep voice cutting through the hum of the crowd. Ladies and gentlemen, he began, his tone calm but commanding. I won't take much of your time, but there's something you all need to know. The room fell silent, all eyes turning to him. Margaret's expression tightened, a flicker of unease passing across her face. Tonight isn't just about celebration, Hunter continued. It's about truth. And the truth is, one among us has used power and influence to exploit the most vulnerable among us for personal gain. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Margaret's smile faltered as she stepped forward. Hunter, I'm not sure what you're implying, but you know exactly what I'm implying, he interrupted, his voice sharper now. For years, Margaret Donovan has hidden behind her reputation, laundering money through charities and orchestrating illegal adoptions. She's preyed on children, profited from their suffering. Margaret's composure cracked, her voice rising as she tried to regain control. This is absurd. Do you have any idea what you're accusing me of? Hunter's gaze was cold. I do, and I have the evidence to prove it. Sophia stepped forward, holding up the folder they had risked everything to obtain. Elise Grayson knew the truth. She gave her life trying to stop you. And now, we're here to finish what she started. Margaret's face twisted with fury, and she turned to the crowd, her voice sharp. This is nothing more than a desperate attempt to tarnish my name. Don't let them fool you. But before she could say more, a commotion erupted near the back of the room. Margaret's security guards moved in, their intentions clear. Hunter stepped protectively in front of Sophia as chaos unfolded. Get out of here, he ordered, his voice urgent. Now. I'm not leaving you, Sophia said firmly. We finish this, together. A guard lunged toward them, and in the struggle, Sophia was thrown to the ground. Pain shot through her shoulder, but she forced herself up, her determination unwavering. Hunter fought off the guards with a ferocity she hadn't seen before, his focus on protecting her at all costs. Finally, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Elijah had come through, tipping off the authorities. Police officers stormed the ballroom, arresting Margaret and her accomplices as the stunned crowd looked on. Hunter knelt beside Sophia, his hands trembling as he checked her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice raw with worry. Sophia winced but managed a small smile. "Nothing I can't handle." Hunter's shoulders sagged with relief, and for a moment, his mask slipped, revealing the depth of his emotions. "I thought I'd lost you," he said quietly. Sophia reached for his hand, her grip steady despite the pain. "You didn't, and you never will." As Margaret was led away in handcuffs, the weight of Elise's sacrifice and their own efforts finally began to lift. They had won, but the fight wasn't over yet. The fallout from the gala was immediate and unrelenting. Headlines splashed across every major outlet, detailing the shocking allegations against Margaret Donovan and the evidence brought forward by Hunter Grayson and Sophia Miller. For the first time in years, the Grayson name was not synonymous with wealth and power, but with scandal and a fight for justice. Hunter stood in his study, staring at the television as reporters dissected every detail of the story. His jaw tightened as they replayed footage of him on stage, accusing Margaret and revealing the dark truth. His calm, composed demeanor had cracked under the weight of what he'd exposed, and now the world was watching. Sophia entered the room, a stack of papers in her hands. She placed them on the desk and looked at Hunter, her expression a mixture of determination and concern. "The press is relentless," she said, "but it's working. People are listening." Hunter turned to face her, his shoulders heavy with the burden of his choice. "They're listening, but at what cost? The Grayson name is in ruins, Sophia. Everything Elise and I fought to protect." Sophia stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. "Elise didn't fight to protect the family name, Hunter. She fought to protect people. And because of you, her fight means something now." Hunter's gaze softened, but the weight of guilt still lingered. "She would have hated this kind of attention," he said quietly, "but she would have done it anyway." Sophia placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. "And so did you. Because it was the right thing to do." Hunter exhaled deeply, his walls crumbling as he allowed himself to feel the enormity of what they had accomplished. "Elise would have been proud," he said, his voice breaking as tears welled in his eyes. Sophia didn't hesitate, wrapping her arms around him as he finally let go of the emotions he had buried for so long. The man who had once seemed untouchable now stood before her, raw and human. Meanwhile, Sophia had taken her own steps to rally support. Using Elise's journal and her own story, she reached out to advocacy groups and media outlets. The story of the adoption ring, of Elise's sacrifice, and of Margaret's corruption sparked outrage and action. Survivors came forward, sharing their stories and demanding accountability. By the end of the week, authorities confirmed that the adoption ring was dismantled. Margaret's allies had begun to turn on her, cutting deals to save themselves while further incriminating her. The weight of justice was finally bearing down on the empire she had built. As the dust settled, Hunter and Sophia sat together in the study, the tension of the past weeks slowly giving way to a cautious sense of hope. "You changed everything, Sophia," Hunter said, his voice steady now. "Not just for me, but for all of them." Sophia smiled faintly, her hand brushing against his. "We did it together. For Elise. For everyone she fought for." The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt like a path worth walking. The Grayson mansion felt different now. The heavy silence that once filled its halls was replaced by a quiet warmth, a sense of peace that had been absent for years. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the once intimidating spaces and breathing life into the cold stone walls. Sophia stood in the sitting room, gazing at the piano that had once been a symbol of tension and unspoken pain. Now, it was something else entirely, a reminder of the courage and strength that had brought them to this moment. She ran her fingers over the polished surface, her mind drifting to Elise. She would have loved to see this. Hunter's voice came from the doorway. He entered the room, his expression lighter than she had ever seen it. The usual tension in his shoulders was gone, replaced by a calm resolve. Sophia turned to him, a small smile playing on her lips. "I hope so. This house feels different now." Hunter nodded, his gaze sweeping over the room. It's taken me a long time to realize that this place isn't what mattered. It was the people in it. Elise knew that. She always did. Sophia walked toward him, her footsteps quiet on the marble floor. And now you do too. Hunter met her eyes, his gratitude evident. Thanks to you. Their days had been spent rebuilding, not just the Grayson name, but their own sense of purpose. Hunter had thrown himself into ensuring the children affected by Margaret's crimes were given the support and resources they needed. Sophia had joined him, using her connection to Elise's legacy to give a voice to those who had been silenced for so long. Together, they tackled the challenges of moving forward. The cracks in Hunter's walls had become windows, allowing light and understanding to shine through. And in those moments, Sophia saw the man Elise had believed in, the man Hunter had once thought he could never become. One evening, as they sat together in the library, Sophia looked around the room that had once intimidated her. Now, it felt warm, familiar. She turned to Hunter, her voice soft. You know, I used to think home was a place. But it's not. Hunter raised an eyebrow, a hint of a smile on his lips. Oh, then what is it? Sophia reached for his hand, her gaze steady. It's a person, or in this case, two people who found their way back to who they were meant to be. Hunter squeezed her hand gently, his smile widening. I think Elise would agree. As the night deepened, they sat together, their hands intertwined. The mansion that had once been a symbol of pain and regret now stood as a testament to healing and hope, a place where they could finally begin again. The crowd at the community center was small but engaged, their faces a mix of curiosity and quiet determination. Sophia stood at the podium, her hands resting lightly on the edges as she addressed the room. The words came easily now, though they were no less emotional than the first time she had spoken about her journey. Elise Grayson believed in justice, Sophia said, her voice steady. She believed that every child deserved a chance to grow up safe and loved. She gave everything she had to fight for that belief, and today, we honor her by continuing that fight. Hunter watched from the side of the room, his expression a mix of pride and reflection. It had taken time, but the work they had done together, advocating for adoption reform, connecting with families, and exposing the systems that allowed corruption to flourish, had begun to bear fruit. New policies were being drafted, investigations had expanded, and the voices of survivors were being heard. When Sophia stepped down from the podium, Hunter joined her, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. The applause was warm and heartfelt, a testament to the impact of their efforts. As the crowd began to disperse, the two found a quiet moment outside beneath the evening sky. The air was cool, the stars above twinkling like tiny beacons of hope. She would have been proud of you, Sophia said softly, turning to look at Hunter. She would have been proud of us, Hunter corrected, his voice filled with quiet conviction. You made this possible, Sophia. You gave her memory the justice it deserved. Sophia smiled, her heart full. It wasn't just me. We did this together. And we're not done yet. Hunter nodded, his gaze lifting to the stars. No, we're not. But for the first time, it feels like we're moving in the right direction. They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the past giving way to the promise of the future. Finally, Hunter turned to her, his voice soft but firm. Together, we'll make sure her light never fades. Sophia reached for his hand, her grip steady and sure. We will. As they walked back toward the car, the world felt just a little brighter. The journey that had begun in darkness was now illuminated by hope, a legacy of love and resilience that would guide them forward.